Meditations on the Tarot, Letter 9, Force, Part 2. It is said that union makes force, and one understands by this the alliance of individual wills with a view to achieving a common aim. It is the formula for the quantitative increase of force. With respect to qualitative force, it would be appropriate to say that unity is force, because one is strong only insofar as there is unity of spirit, soul and body, i.e. insofar as there is virginity. It is inner conflict that renders us weak, the fact that we serve 2 or even 3 masters at the same time. The Emerald Table of Hermes states not only the principle of universal analogy, but also that of universal force, to accomplish the miracles of one thing. It teaches concerning the strongest of all powers, the force of all forces, for it overcometh every subtle thing, and doth penetrate every solid substance. Tabula Smaragdina 9. The force taught by the Emerald Table is the unity in action of heaven and earth, for Thelema, the fundamental will, doth ascend from earth to heaven. Again it doth descend to earth, and uniteth in itself the force from things superior and things inferior. Tabula Smaragdina 8. Let us now examine the 2 aspects of force which the Emerald Table speaks of, namely, that it overcometh every subtle thing, and doth penetrate every solid substance. Firstly, it overcometh every subtle thing. The deeper meaning, mystical, Gnostic, magical and hermetic, of overcoming is to change the enemy into a friend. To render him impotent only is not yet victory. Thus the Germany of 1914 was certainly rendered impotent in 1918, but was not overcome, as the year 1939 proves. But after the defeat of 1945, Germany was certainly overcome, insofar as she is sincerely allied to her old adversaries. The same applies to Japan as a state. On another plane, it is likewise true that the devil will be overcome only at the moment when his voice, no matter whether it is rough or smooth, will be heard in chorus with the choirs of celestial hierarchies praising God. Saul of Tarsus was the very soul of the persecution of Christians. Paul the Apostle was the very soul of the work of conquest of the so-called pagan world for Christianity. Here is a case of authentic victory in the true sense of the word. And it is authentic victory that one must hope for and wait for in the conflict that tradition represents as the struggle between the archistrategist Michael and the dragon. The day when it is achieved will be the day of a new festival, the festival of the coronation of the Virgin on earth. For then the principle of opposition will be replaced on earth by that of collaboration. This will be the triumph of life over electricity, and cerebral intellectuality will then bow before wisdom, or Sophia, and will unite with her. To overcome every subtle thing is therefore equivalent to changing opposing forces, mental, psychic and electrical, into friendly and allied forces. The subtle things to overcome are the intellectual forces of temptation based on doubt, the psychic forces of temptation based on sterile enjoyment, and the electrical forces of temptation based on power. In the last analysis, the subtle things meant here are therefore equivalent to temptations. However, every temptation is similar to a 2-way flow of traffic, because when evil tempts good, it is itself at the same time tempted by the latter. Temptation always entails contact, and therefore an exchange of influence. Every beautiful temptress, in attempting to tempt a saint, risks finishing up by wetting his feet with her tears, wiping them with the hair of her head, kissing them, and anointing them with ointment. Luke 7:38. Do we not have prefigured here the victory over the great prostitute Babylon? Have we not discovered the root and core of the much celebrated and lamented fall of Babylon, described in chapters 17 and 18 of the Apocalypse? Doubt, sterile enjoyment, power. These constitute together the technology of temptation. First of all, doubt. It is the principle of division and opposition, and therefore of illness. For just as intellectual doubt divides the intellect by confronting it with two contrary tableaus, and reduces it to the impotence of indecision, so is bodily illness a doubt in the organism, i.e. two tendencies opposed to one another, reducing it to impotence and constraining it to remain in bed. Doubt is to faith as the sight of eyes suffering from astigmatism is to normal eyesight. Just as normal eyes either do not see or see together, so does faith see, whether more or less is not important, with the higher eye and the lower eye together. For certainty is due to the coordinated vision of the higher or transcendent self, this is the higher eye, and the lower or empirical self, which is the lower eye. Doubt appears when the higher eye and the lower eye do not see together. There is then a spiritual astigmatism, a lack of coordination between the two seers in man. Doubt is a beast with two horns, since it only bifurcates. However, doubt that is mastered under the control of the will and put into its service proves to be prodigiously useful, as the whole history of science shows. There, doubt is utilized as the instrument of scientific faith. There, one doubts within the precise limits of the scientific method, being guided by and in the interests of scientific faith. If Pasteur had not doubted spontaneous generation on the one hand, and if he had not had faith in observation and experimentation on the other hand, we would not now benefit from the fruits of the Pasteurian revolution in biology and medicine. Productive though it is in the scientific domain, doubt nevertheless entails expenses that must be paid. Its practice, be it only by using it as a method, results in partial blindness. It renders us one-eyed. For the fact of regularly turning away from the higher eye, from its message and testimony, and confining oneself to the lower eye, the five senses plus cerebral intellectuality, cannot fail sooner or later to have its effect, i.e. to render one-eyed he who assiduously practices the use of one eye instead of two. And exactly as the great doctors of theology, metaphysics, and mysticism of the Middle Ages proved to be sterile in what concerns medicine, biology, physics, physiology, and other sciences, the help of which saves in France alone 69,000 human lives each year from the bane of tuberculosis, and has reduced mortality due to typhoid fever by more than 97%, mortality due to diphtheria also by 97%, that due to scarlet fever by 98%, etc. Dr. Etienne May, La Médecine, son passé, son présent, son avenir, pages 336 to 337. So are the doctors of the sciences of our time sterile in what concerns the vital spiritual needs of mankind. The former had an eye only for the spiritual, the latter have an eye only for the temporal. Is it necessary to be one-eyed in order to produce something of value, whether scientific or spiritual? No. Individual examples, including the recent example of the author of The Phenomenon of Man and Le Milieu Divin, prove it. And esoteric Hermeticism, i.e. Hermeticism cultivated within the inner forum of consciousness, is called to play a role, whether visible or invisible is of little importance, as a link in each individual's inner forum of consciousness, between what is given by the two eyes. It can certainly be an agent in establishing coordination of the two eyes, between culture and civilization, between spirituality and progress, between religion and science. It can act as a healing agent in this singular contemporary illness, which is a kind of schizophrenia, of the dissociation between spirituality and intellectuality. But it can do so only in the inner forum of each individually, in order to guard against arrogating functions of general significance belonging properly to church and academia. Briefly, the role which it is called to play is anonymous and intimate, and is not provided with the means of the armory or of collectives, such as pamphlets, press, radio, television, and congresses, where a great din is made. The magic of the constant work of service done in silence. This is what it is a matter of. A secret, then? Not at all, for a private thing is not a secret thing. The private life is not a secret life. Silence, as the essential condition for intimate work, is in no way equivalent to a jealously guarded secret. Just as Trappist monks maintain silence without anyone suspecting them of wanting to keep secrets, so is the community composed of Hermeticists scattered in the world in the right to be silent, in order to maintain the atmosphere of privacy essential for its work, without it being suspected of dark secrets. Authentic spiritual life requires the inviolable sanctuary of privacy, which has nothing in common with initiation secrets or those of secret societies, whose secrets furthermore inevitably become open secrets. Let us now consider sterile enjoyment. The role that certain schools of philosophy and psychology assign to pleasure as the final cause of all human activity, including moral activity, is well known. According to them, man would not have any desire to act if he did not have the promise of real or imaginary pleasure. What is pleasure? It is the lowest constituent of the scale: pleasure, joy, blissfulness, beatitude. It is only the psychophysical signal announcing accord between what one desires and what one attains. Being only a signal, it does not have moral value in itself. It is desire whose satisfaction it signals, which falls under the moral qualification of good or evil. This is why pleasure can be followed by joy or disgust, according to the case. Pleasure is therefore a reaction, at the surface of man's psychic being, to objective events. In other words, a life dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure alone would be the most superficial that one could imagine for a human being. Joy is more profound than pleasure. It is still an index, but what it indicates is deeper than the relationship between a desire and the event of its being satisfied. Joy is the state of soul which participates most intensely in life and experiences it in appreciating its value. Joy is the spreading of the soul beyond the limits of conscious awareness. It signifies an augmentation of the soul's vital elan. Blissfulness is the state of the human being where spirit, soul, and body are united in a comprehensive rhythm. It is the rhythm of the spiritual, psychic, and bodily life brought into harmony. Lastly, beatitude transcends blissfulness, insofar as the state which it comprises is higher than that in which the rhythm of the human spirit, soul, and body holds sway. It is the state of the actual presence of the fourth, of God. It is therefore the state of the beatic vision, or visio beatifica, of Christian tradition. Pleasure is therefore most peripheral and superficial on the scale of blessedness. Yet in the technique of temptation it plays the same role with regard to the soul as doubt does with regard to the spirit. For just as doubt reduces the spirit to impotence, so does pleasure, or sterile enjoyment, reduce the soul to impotence, to a state of passivity. It enslaves it and changes it from the subject into an object of action. Lastly, power. Here again, schools of philosophy and psychology have erected the will to power as the supreme principle of human activity. According to them, man aspires only to power, and religion, science, and art are only means to this end. Now, it is true that no one desires powerlessness as such, and if we worship the crucifix, which is the symbol of complete out of powerlessness, we do so because it is at the same time the symbol of supreme inner power. For there is power and power. The one enslaves and the other liberates. The one constrains, the other inspires. True power always appears as powerlessness, for it is always due to a kind of crucifixion. False power, however, crucifies others. This is because it knows of no other growth than that at the expense of others. An autocrat is powerful only when he has reduced to impotence all other candidates, all the independent elements in his country. A hypnotist is powerful insofar as the number of people who resist his hypnosis is small. A philosophical system is powerful insofar as it compels minds to accept it by the weight of the totality of its arguments. Fichte attempted to compel the reader to understand. Ein Versuch Die Laser zum Verstehen zu zwingen. Lastly, a machine is powerful insofar as it is capable of rendering powerless the obstacles which prevent it from functioning. Now, the technique of temptation in the domain of power consists in substituting false power for the true, in the substitution of the power of compulsion or electricity for that of freedom of inspiration and healing, or life, or Zoe. Sacred magic has nothing in common with the power which compels. It operates only with currents of life, or Zoe, spiritual, psychic, and physical. Even its armory, such as the swords of the Archangel Michael and the holy cherubim who guard the gate of Eden, are showers of rays of life whose intensity is such as to repulse or put to flight anyone who is either opposed to life or who cannot support its intensity. And on the other hand, it attracts and vivifies anyone who aspires to life and who can support its intensity. Who knows how many people otherwise ill or despairing owe the re-establishment of their physical or psychic health to the sword of the Archangel Michael? There are no statistics of this kind, but if there were, one would probably be astonished at the number of victims of the flaming sword. Be that as it may, the swords in question are powerful arms of true power. They are the fruits of outer powerlessness, i.e., they are forces due to crucifixion. For the guardian of freedom is, by this very fact, the victim of freedom. He has also to endure the age-old abuse of the freedom that he protects. It is the age-old powerlessness towards the abuse of freedom. Therefore it is an age-old crucifixion, which is the source of power concentrated in the sword of the archistrategist Michael. It is the same with the flaming sword of the cherubim set in the east of Eden. Here again it is divine impotence in relation to human freedom, which latter chose the way of the fall, impotence which nourished and concentrated the sword. Thus here is the choice which each of us is called to make, the choice between the power of crucifixion and that of compulsion. To pray or to order, which would we prefer? Electricity in its triple form, physical, psychic and mental, is an instrument which lends itself prodigiously to the service of the will to power, i.e. to the desire to order and subjugate. For this reason it is a temptation for mankind. Mankind is confronted by the choice between the power of sacred magic and that of mechanics, a choice which, in the last analysis, amounts to one between life, or Zoe, and electricity. These are therefore the three principal, subtle things which are overcome by force or virginity. 2. It doth penetrate every solid substance. Solidity is the experience of an obstacle to our freedom of movement. Air is certainly not it, whilst a wall of stone certainly is. Similarly, mistrust towards you can erect a veritable psychic wall which can be an insurmountable obstacle to your movement aiming at contact and the communication of ideas. Similarly, again, a well-defined and rigid intellectual system can render you dumb with regard to the person who is held under its power. It would be impossible, for example, to reach the inner organ of comprehension of an orthodox Marxist or a Freudian psychoanalyst in speaking to them of authentic mystical experience. The one would hear only what lends itself to interpretation by the concept of narcosis, remaining quite deaf to the rest, and the other would have an open ear only for that which lends itself to interpretation by the concept of sublimation of libido, i.e. for what lets itself be reduced to the play of sexuality. Therefore, here again, there is a wall. Now, there is physical, psychic, and mental solidity. All three forms of solidity have in common that they are experienced as obstacles to our movement. They are experienced as impenetrable. Nevertheless, the Emerald Table affirms that every solid substance, i.e. each physical, psychic, and mental obstacle, is certainly penetrable for force or virginity. How? By action opposite to that of explosion, i.e. by emollient action. With regard to a mental obstacle presented by a rigid intellectual system, force will not occupy itself with the mental formation itself, but will admit its breath into the heart of the person concerned. The heart having tasted life, Zoe, the creative movement of life will pass its breath to the head, and will breathe movement into the mental formation. This latter having been set in motion, not by doubt, but rather by creative elan, will lose its rigidity and will become fluid. It is thus that the liquefaction of crystallized mental formations is effected. With respect to psychic obstacles, it is again emollient action which effects the transformation of a psychic complex from rigidity into sensitivity. Here again it is the breath of life which dissolves the complex, by way of the heart, so that the mistrust, fear or hate concentrated in the complex is dispersed and the soul is left free of the blinding influence of the psychic complex. Lastly, physical obstacles exist for force, i.e. for the radiation of life, only insofar as they are due to morbid processes of crystallization in living organisms. If we give them a common comprehensive name, it is sclerosis. This constitutes the obstacle in general. Sclerosis is the process of gradual alienation of the body from the soul and spirit. A corpse is the limit and end of this, because the corpse is a body completely alienated with regard to the soul and spirit. This is what Dr. Etienne May says in making an assessment from the standpoint of modern-day medicine. Quote, "With regard to arterial sclerosis, it is to a certain extent a natural modification of the arteries with age. And thus, pushing this to an absurd extreme, one can almost say that, all other illnesses being suppressed, sclerosis of the arteries, in the long run obligatory, would alone prevent us from becoming immortal." Dr. Etienne May, La médecine, son passé, son présent, son avenir, page 341. Sclerosis is therefore death itself, which is at work during life in modifying, little by little, the living body into a corpse. At least this is what it appears to be, seen in the light of modern medicine and biology. There are nonetheless two different ways of dying. The one is where the body refuses to serve as the instrument for the soul, which is the case with sclerosis. The other is that where the principle which vivifies and animates the body retires and thus is missed by the body. It is then the soul which quits the body. In the first case, it is the body which expels the soul. In the second case, it is the soul which refuses to make use of the body any longer. One dies, therefore, because the body becomes unserviceable for life, or otherwise because life itself retires from the body. In the latter case, one certifies from a clinical point of view a generally increasing lapse of biological functions, which advances to the point where the activity of respiration and circulation halts, i.e., where clinical death takes place. This can happen in the state of deep sleep, at the hours when vitality is normally at its minimum, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning. Then one says that death was due to old age, pure and simple, without any specific ailment, including sclerosis, being the cause. With respect to hardening of the arteries, or arteriosclerosis, this process has long been considered as an inevitable consequence of advancing age. But one knows nowadays that there is arteriosclerosis in young people, and that there are old people whose arteries, without speaking of the brain and nervous system, remain subtle. Dr. Etienne May, La médecine, son passé, son présent, son avenir, page 346. One can therefore die with supple arteries without cancer and without being the victim of pathological viruses. One can depart entirely, just as one departs partially when one falls asleep. Now, there are several modes of sleeping. There is sleep and sleep. You can believe or not believe in the testimony of the Kabbalah, which describes what is said to happen during the sleep of the righteous, during the sleep of ordinary people, and during the sleep of sinners. It is described how at the hour of midnight the Ancient of Days draws near to the earth and arrives at the gate of Eden, where the souls of the righteous meet him, etc. However, there is no one who does not know from sure experience what arises during sleep at night, in diverse states not only of health but also of the soul. The overwhelming cares of one day can be changed during sleep into things of secondary importance, and can even appear insignificant, whilst insignificant things of the day before, which skated almost imperceptibly across the screen of your memory before sleep, can acquire in dream a singular importance which was not at all surmised the preceding day. How many different ways of awakening! How moods, states of mind, desires, general states of soul differ when you awake, for example, after a Christmas night or an Easter night, or some night in November or February. If the ways of awakening are as different as black and white, it is because there are as many different kinds of sleep. Just as there are several modes of sleeping, so there are several modes of dying. It is again the Kabbalah which makes mention of this, and which describes a whole scale of ways of dying, the summit of which would be death due to the kiss of the Eternal One. According to the Kabbalah, conscious or unconscious ecstasy would therefore be the most sublime cause of death. Must an ecstatic rapture necessarily be sudden, or can it be slow and gradual as well? Consider the process of death, where it is not the body which refuses to serve the soul, but rather where it is the soul itself which gradually quits the body. Could this not be the visible manifestation of invisible ecstasy, of the increasing attraction of the divine working in the very depths of the soul? Would not increasing nostalgia suffice to explain the gradual departure of vital elan that is recorded in the case of general decline resulting in death? Be that as it may, this is not only what the Kabbalah teaches, but also contemporary Christian Hermeticism. The Hermetic teaching is as follows. During the period of preparation for so-called natural death, i.e. caused neither by the unserviceability of the organism, nor by violent interference from outside, nor by poisoning, a well-defined process takes place in the vital body, the etheric body, or nefesh, according to the Kabbalah. There the vital forces concentrate little by little in the region of the 8-petaled lotus, which is the crown center. To the extent that this concentration in the crown region of the head, in fact even above the head if one understands by head the physical brain, takes place, vital activity diminishes, at first in the lower region of the organism, i.e. the genital and intestinal region, then in the region of the stomach, and lastly in the central region, in the neighborhood of the heart. At the moment when the concentration of vitality at the crown center is complete, the heart and also the circulatory and respiratory systems cease their activity. This is the moment of death. Now, the process here corresponds to the ecstasy to which one aspires in the practice of yoga. For the state of samadhi, or yogic ecstasy, is realized in terms of esoteric physio-psychergy by the concentration of energy arising from the lower region of the body, in the crown region, in the region of the 1,000-petaled lotus, or sahasrara. The 8-petaled lotus is designated in India as 1,000-petaled because of its intense scintillation, which gives the impression of a multitude of petals, 1,000. Once the energy is concentrated in the crown region, the body is reduced to a state of stupor, and the consciousness of the self departs and is united with the consciousness of the transcendent self, which is the state of samadhi or ecstasy. Samadhi or yogic ecstasy is a temporary or artificial death. Although the Christian ecstasy of sursum corda, or elevation of the heart, differs essentially from samadhi, there is no reason to deny the reality of yogic ecstasy or the fact that it is an authentic ecstasy, albeit not the only possible one. It is therefore quite justifiable to say that so-called natural death is fundamentally a natural ecstasy, notably a natural samadhi, where the transcendent self accomplishes union with the personal self, in withdrawing it from the body and uniting with it. It is, again, a case where force doth penetrate the solid substance when one dies a natural death, having supple arteries and a normal nervous system. It is then force, or zoe, which keeps the blood vessels supple through its emollient action, and which renders natural death possible as a result of natural ecstasy, or the gathering of vital forces above. These, therefore, are some of the facts and thoughts which can contribute to an understanding of the statement from the Tabula Smaragdina, "It doth penetrate every solid substance." The concept of force is that of an intermediary between pure consciousness and manifestation. It is the link between the idea and the phenomenon. Force has two aspects, that of electricity and that of life, or struggle on the one hand and cooperation on the other. These two aspects correspond to the serpent or Nahash and the virgin. Occultists of the school of Eliphas Levi considered the serpent as the great magical agent par excellence, and did not much occupy themselves with the virgin, who bears the principle of sacred magic. They interested themselves above all in the psychic and mental aspect of the principle of electricity, called by them the mobile astral agency, thus desiring to extend the domain of science, which is occupied only with the physical aspect of electricity, to the psychic and mental realms. They wanted to win over to science, i.e. for that understanding which makes use of the method of observation and experimentation, the whole domain of electricity, physical, psychic, and mental. Their dominant preoccupation was therefore to demonstrate that the tradition of ancient and medieval magic contains many a truth, due to observation and experimentation, ignored by science, and that the great magical agent can certainly be placed in the service of human intelligence and will, just as is the energy of electricity and magnetism. The fact is that they enveloped their essential message in a cloud of verbal romanticism, evoking the mild shivers that accompany allusions to secret initiations, to the mysteries of age-old secret fraternities of adepts who know and accomplish all that is worth the trouble of knowing and accomplishing, to mysterious communities of sages and mages who possess, across the ages, the knowledge and power for the occult government of the world, secretly fashioning the destiny of mankind. The fact of this romanticism, quite understandable and excusable moreover, does not at all prevent an understanding of the true task that they were pursuing in establishing facts and in sifting out laws and principles from the totality of occult traditions and experiences. What they were doing in reality, disregarding the romanticism, was elaborating a modern science from the raw material of occult traditions and experiences. May at long last the whisperers be silent, all those who spread rumours about the work of these occultists, placing them under suspicion of Satanism and dark practices. They are no more, nor less, Satanists than the people who, for example, treat mental patients with electric shocks, and they are without doubt innocent angels in comparison with the physicists who discovered nuclear energy and put it in the service of destruction. It is time, once and for all, that an end is made to the foolish and unpleasant accusations concerning contemporary doctors of occultism, of Satanism or black magic. They are, if the worst comes to the worst, romantics infatuated with the ideal of an absolute science of a glorious past, and they are, in so far as they are doing their best, pioneers of a science of the ignored or neglected domain of magic, i.e. a science of the dynamic relationships which exist between subjective consciousness and objective phenomena. But, whilst wholly rejecting with indignation all the suspicions and accusations of Satanism with regard to the classical authors of contemporary occultism, I regret nevertheless that they preferred science to Hermeticism, and consequently dedicated their efforts in preference to the study of the principle of the serpent, that of psychic and mental electricity, instead of devoting themselves to the task of rendering themselves capable of participating consciously in the principle of the Virgin, that of psychic and mental life. If they had chosen Hermeticism, i.e. the spiritual life which comprises the totality of mysticism, gnosis, magic, and the perennial philosophy, they would have written collectively a modern Christian Zohar, or Book of Splendor, and they would have poured out into the world a flow of wisdom and spiritual life which would have been able to accomplish a true spiritual renaissance in the Western world. Lots of knowledge, but too little wisdom. This is what must be said to the representatives of occult science of our time. It is not the scholars and experimenters who are called to realize a spiritual springtime in the Western world, but rather those participating in authentic sources of the profound life, the deeper life of thinking, feeling, and the will. In order for this to take place, thought must become meditative, feeling contemplative, and the will ascetic. For in order to attain authentic sources of the profound life, one must seek profound thought, which is meditation. One must seek profound feeling, which is contemplation. And one must seek the primal will beyond desires and longings, which is asceticism. It is thus that conscious participation in authentic spiritual life is gained, and it is thus that the sources of this life are opened. The Virgin, the force of our arcanum, is the principle of springtime, i.e. that of creative spiritual elan and spiritual flourishing. The prodigious flourishing of philosophy and the arts in ancient Athens took place under the sign of the Virgin. Similarly, the flourishing of the Renaissance of Florence was under the vernal sign of the Virgin. Also, Weimar at the beginning of the 19th century was a place where the breath of the Virgin perceptibly moved hearts and minds. In ancient Egypt, the domain of the mysteries of death was attributed to Osiris, and that of life, including language, writing, law, and the arts, was attributed to Isis. Thus, Isis was the soul of the civilization of ancient Egypt, which we are still admiring after more than 20 centuries. The sickness of the West today is that it is more and more lacking creative elan. The Reformation, rationalism, the French Revolution, materialistic faith of the 19th century, and the Bolshevik Revolution show that everywhere mankind is turning away from the Virgin. The consequence of this is that the sources of creative, spiritual elan are drying up, one after the other, and that an increasing aridity is showing up in all domains of the spiritual life of the West. It is said that the West is growing old. But why? Because it lacks creative elan, because it has turned away from the source of creative elan, because it has turned away from the Virgin. Without virginity there is no springtime, there is neither freshness nor youth. For this reason, it is regrettable that most of the authors and doctors of contemporary occultism also side with the dethroners of the Virgin. Thus they turn towards scientism, i.e. towards knowledge which unveils and undresses, and they turn away from wisdom, i.e. from knowledge which is veiled and dressed with symbols, which is due not to scrutinizing observation, but rather to revelatory worship. For there is a world of difference between a scientific scrutinizer of the naked truth and a worshipper of the truth which is revealed through symbols. The former is inevitably an iconoclast, the latter is an iconodule. The former seeks nudity, the latter prepares himself for revelation through the fullness of symbolism. Now, the Hermeticist is essentially an iconophile. For him, symbols are not obstacles that must be eliminated in order to arrive at knowledge of the truth, but rather means for receiving revelation. The clothes, the symbols of truth, are for him not what hides it, but rather what reveals it. The entire world, insofar as it is a series of symbols, does not hide but reveals the word. The divine commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," is also applicable to the domain of knowledge. He who denies the life of symbols kills them in his thought. For to deny that which reveals means to kill that which lives in the domain of thought. The iconoclast is an intellectual murderer. The Hermeticist is, in contrast, an iconophile and traditionalist. This means to say that he does not side with the successive waves of iconoclasm, the waves named Reformation, Enlightenment, Scientific Faith, which set fire to forests of symbols protecting the intellectual sun of humanity against barrenness and erosion. This means to say also that he has as a basic principle not only the commandment, thou shalt not kill, but also the commandment which is the foundation of all tradition, i.e. all continuity in progress, growth, development, and evolution, the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. To honor father and mother is the spirit and soul of tradition, of constructive continuation from the past to the present, of true progress across the ages of the path of the life of mankind towards truth. It is still more. It is the very essence of the life of the spirit and the soul, because it is the experience of honoured paternal love which renders us capable of raising our gaze to heaven and saying with sincerity and authenticity, Pater noster qui es in coelis, our Father who art in heaven. And it is the experience of honoured maternal love which underlies our prayer, Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us. The source of spiritual life is in this experience of the two aspects of love, the virile love which provides for and directs our steps towards what is good for us, and the tender love which assuages all our tears. Now, when care and tenderness manifest themselves amongst human beings on earth, it is unthinkable that this unparalleled treasure is not also to be found at the very depths of the world from which mankind has arisen. Here is the foundation of natural religion in human consciousness, and therefore of all confidence in divine order, all worship of the invisible, and all aspiration towards the invisible. And this aspiration proves to be well founded. The invisible is in fact neither deaf nor mute. This latter fact is the foundation of supernatural religion in the experience of human consciousness, which experiences the action of grace and revelation from above. Grace and revelation are the manifestation of paternal love from above, just as it is said in the Sermon on the Mount. What man of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Matthew 7, 9-11. Hermeticism, insofar as it is a living tradition for more than 30 centuries, owes its life to the commandment, Honour thy father and thy mother. For this commandment brings longevity with it, as moreover is said in the text, Honour thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long in the land which the Lord God gives thee. Exodus 20:12. It is in honouring the transcendent God, our Father who is in heaven, and the soul of non-fallen nature, the Virgin Mother, that Hermeticism, in spite of numerous temporary aberrations on the part of its representatives, who at one time have given themselves up to pagan philosophism, at another time to Kabbalism without Christ, or to alchemism in order to make material gold, or lastly to modern scientism, has survived Egyptian decadence, Greco-Roman pagan decadence, the organized theologism of the Middle Ages, the iconoclasm of the Reformation, the rationalism of the Enlightenment, and, lastly, the scientism of the 19th century. Even though Hermeticism has every reason to regret, to repent, to expiate and make good a lot of its past, in this it is no exception, as all man's spiritual traditions have sinned a lot. Its longevity, however, is due to the fact that, fundamentally, it has honoured its celestial and terrestrial parents. It is not true, as its adversaries would have it, that its longevity is due to the persistence in human nature of the vices of morbid curiosity and arrogant presumption, which latter refuses to bow before a mystery. No, Hermeticism lives and survives from century to century, thanks to its essential faithfulness to the divine commandments, Thou shalt not kill, and honour thy father and thy mother. As a Hermeticist, I honour all the spiritual fathers and mothers of earthly mankind's past who have contributed to its spiritual life, including all the ancient sages, the patriarchs, Moses, the prophets, Greek philosophers, Kabbalists, apostles and saints, the masters of the scholastic school, Christian mystics, and many others besides. Is this, therefore, syncretism? No, but thanks should be accorded to those to whom it is due. To deny is to kill, to forget is to bury. To honor and appreciate is to preserve living, to restore to memory is to recall to life. In honoring much, Hermeticism participates in the life of much, therefore it has much life. It is to this that Hermeticism owes its longevity. In writing all these things, I am concerned all the time with the subject of force, the 11th arcanum of the tarot. For force is life, and longevity is an important aspect of it. The Virgin is not only the source of creative elan, but also of spiritual longevity. This is why the West, in turning away more and more from the Virgin, is growing old, i.e., it is distancing itself from the rejuvenating source of longevity. Each revolution which has taken place in the West, that of the Reformation, the French Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the delirium of nationalism, the Communist Revolution, has advanced the process of aging in the West, because each has signified a further distancing from the principle of the Virgin. In other words, Our Lady is Our Lady, and is not to be replaced with impunity either by the goddess reason, or by the goddess biological evolution, or by the goddess economy. The adulation of all these goddesses bears witness to the unfaithfulness of so-called Christian mankind. It very much resembles the sort of spiritual adultery which the biblical prophets gave so much utterance to. It is, still more, a sin against one of the commandments of faithfulness to the principle of non-fallen nature, the Virgin Mother, namely the commandment, Thou shalt not commit adultery. Every living spiritual tradition ought to be faithful to its original impulse, to the essence and substance of the cause that it espouses, and to the ideal aim that it pursues. In other words, it will preserve its identity only by remaining faithful to its effective cause, to its formal and material causes, and to its final cause. The four modes of causality of the traditional school of logic, causa efficiens, causa formalis, causa materialis, and causa finalis, also constitute the logic of causality for all living spiritual tradition. For every spiritual tradition has its original impulse, its principle and its method, as well as its ideal. It is always the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vau He, which underlies the reality of life, as well as logical causality. The effective cause, the original impulse, is the Yod of the tetragrammaton. The formal cause is the first He, the material cause is the Vau, and the final cause is the second He. Source, law, method, and aim constitute the tetragrammaton of every living spiritual tradition. A spiritual tradition of universal significance, whose effective cause was God, whose formal cause was the law, whose material cause was the community of Israel, or the Shekinah, and whose final cause was the Christ, was founded, or rather engendered, in the desert at Mount Sinai. This tradition was an alliance in the manner of a marriage, and the conditions of durability of this tradition, or alliance, or marriage, are found expounded in the 10 Commandments received on Mount Sinai. Their totality is, so to say, a portrait of the Virgin, the Shekinah, i.e., non-fallen nature or divine force. The Kabbalists of the Zohar certainly understood this, namely that the soul of the Torah, or the law, is the Virgin Mother. Quote, the Torah is situated between two houses, one recondite and on high, and the other more accessible. The one on high is the great voice referred to in the verse, a great voice which did not cease, Deuteronomy 5:22. This voice is in the recesses, and is not heard or revealed, and when it issues from the throat it utters the aspirate without sound, and it flows on without ceasing, though it is so tenuous as to be inaudible. From this issues the Torah, which is the voice of Jacob. The audible voice issues from the inaudible. In due course speech is attached to it, and through the force of that speech it emerges into the open. The voice of Jacob, which is the Torah, is thus attached to two females, to this inner voice which is inaudible, and to this outer voice which is heard. Strictly speaking, there are two which are inaudible, and two which are heard. The two which are not heard are, first, the supernal wisdom, which is located in the thought, and is not disclosed or heard, and secondly, the same wisdom when it issues and discloses itself a little in a whisper, which cannot be heard, being then called the great voice, which is very tenuous and issues in a whisper. The two which are heard are those which issue from this source, the voice of Jacob and the articulation which accompanies it. This great voice which cannot be heard is a house to the supernal wisdom. The female is always called house, and the articulation we have mentioned is a house to the voice of Jacob, which is the Torah, and therefore the Torah commences with the letter Beth, which is, as it were, a house to it. Zohar 50b, translated by H. Sperling and M. Simon, Volume 1, pages 160 to 161. Now, the written law is the house of the oral law, and the oral law is the house of the voice which whispers, which in its turn is the house of the silent voice, which is the thought, or the house of transcendent wisdom. It is in this sense that the Ten Commandments whisper their message of the integral being of the Virgin, who was the instrument of realization of the aim of the Sinai alliance, the incarnation of the Word. The Ten Commandments represent the formal cause, the principles or the law, of realization of the final cause, the incarnation of the Word, of the tradition founded at Mount Sinai. At the same time, they suggest, by way of whispering, the Virgin, who is the material cause of this realization. Here, therefore, is the tetragrammaton of the tradition inaugurated by the patriarchs and founded anew by Moses. The revelation of God through words and deeds, this is its yod, its effective cause. The revealed law, this is the first hey, its formal cause. The Virgin, present in the law and in the community of Israel as its force life, this is its vow, its material cause. The Messiah, lastly, whose birth is the final cause of the tradition, alliance, marriage of Israel, this is the second hey. The spiritual tradition of Israel being of universal significance, every particular spiritual tradition falls under the law of its origin, life and work. In other words, no spiritual tradition can live or accomplish its mission in the world without conforming to the essential conditions of the origin, life and mission of the tradition of Israel. In other words, again, there are no true traditions other than those modelled on the tradition of Israel. For it is the spiritual tradition par excellence, the model, the prototype and the law of all viable spiritual traditions which have missions to accomplish. The following are the essential conditions to which every viable spiritual tradition must adhere. It must be founded from above, it must observe the Ten Commandments and be inspired by the ideal of virginity, and its aim must be implied in the will which founded it, with every human program withdrawn from it. 1. It must be founded from above. This means to say, in the first place, that the original impulse of a viable spiritual tradition must be given either by explicit revelation or by direct action from above, acting with moral irresistibility. It is in this way that the living traditions represented by the Benedictine, Dominican, Franciscan, Jesuit, and also other orders were founded. An explicit revelation of an irresistible vocation was the source of their origin. Thus, the Benedictine order still flourishes after 15 centuries, Dominican and Franciscan orders after 7 centuries, and the Jesuit order after 4 centuries. Even though it would be easy to draw up a long list of their imperfections and their sins, these orders nonetheless furnish examples of a remarkable longevity. And what they have in common is above all the fact that the origin of the initiative of their foundation was from above. 2. It must observe the 10 Commandments and be inspired by the ideal of virginity. The 10 Commandments signify much more than simply a moral code of daily life. They signify further the hygiene, the method, and the conditions of fructification of the spiritual life, including all forms and degrees of practical esotericism. In this sense, they may be formulated as follows. See Exodus 20, 1-17. 1. Surrender to the living God. Thou shalt have no gods before me. 2. Non-substitution of products of the human mind, or those of nature, for the reality of the living God. Thou shalt not make for thyself a graven image or any likeness. 3. Activity in the name of God without making use of his name in order to adorn oneself with it. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. 4. Practice of meditation. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 5. Continuity of effort and experience, or honor thy father and thy mother. 6. Constructive attitude. Thou shalt not kill. 7. Faithfulness to the alliance. Thou shalt not commit adultery. 8. Renunciation of the desire to accept merit which is neither the fruit of one's own work nor the gift of grace. Thou shalt not steal. 9. Renunciation of an accusatory role towards others. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour. 10. Respectful consideration for the private and personal life of others. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house. These constitute the 10 foundations not only for a healthy moral life, but also for all mystical, Gnostic, magical, and Hermetic practice. In fact, mysticism is the awakening of the soul to the reality of the presence of God. This awakening is possible only towards the living God, only towards the divine person, whereas pantheism offers only the perspective of letting oneself be lulled by the undulation of the ocean of deified nature, and atheism offers only nothingness. Gnosis is what reflected consciousness apprehends of mystical experience and revelation from above. The fundamental law of Gnosis is not to substitute imagery drawn from the human mind or from nature for divine intuition. Magic is the bringing into play of that which consciousness has received from mysticism and Gnosis. Now, the fundamental law of sacred magic is to act in and through the name of the divine, whilst guarding against making the name of the divine an instrument of one's own will. Hermeticism is the life of thought within the whole organism of mysticism, Gnosis, and magic. Its fundamental law is meditation, i.e., the practice of remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Meditation is sanctified rest, where thought is turned towards that which is above. This, then, is the role of the first 4 commandments in spiritual practice. The other 6 commandments state the fundamental laws of spiritual culture or discipline, serving as a basis for the spiritual practice to which the first 4 commandments relate. In truth, in order to advance, one has to learn. In order to learn, one has to appreciate the experience of the past, and one has to continue it. All progress presupposes continuity, coherence between the past, present, and future. This is stated by the 5th commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. There only is real progress within a living tradition. For life, spiritual as well as biological, is always tradition, i.e. continuity. Therefore, one has to abstain from all action that breaks continuity, cutting the current of life. It is the fundamental law of a constructive attitude, which is essential in spiritual life, that is stated by the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill. Continuity, or tradition and life, implies faithfulness to the cause that is espoused, to the direction taken, to the ideal that one has as a guide, and to all alliances with entities above and with human beings below, for the sake of the continuity of life. This is what is stated by the 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. There is carnal adultery, psychic adultery, and spiritual adultery. The biblical prophets spoke of this in relation to the unfaithfulness to the alliance of Sinai on the part of the kings and people of Israel, who on many occasions gave themselves up to cults of Canaanite divinities. This is today also the case when one embraces, for example, the Vedanta or Buddhism, whilst having been baptized and sufficiently instructed in order to have access, given goodwill, to experience of the sublime Christian mysteries. I am speaking neither about the study nor the adoption of the technical methods of yoga, Vedanta or Buddhism, but only about the case where one changes faith, i.e. where one substitutes the ideal of liberation for that of love, an impersonal God for the personal God, return to the state of potentiality or nirvana for the kingdom of God, a wise instructor for the Saviour, and so on. However, there is no element of spiritual adultery in the case of J.M. Deschanel, for example. He is the author of La Voie du Silence, who adapted the technical methods of yoga to Christian spiritual practice. For nothing is more natural and legitimate than to learn and make use of the benefits of experiences accumulated in the East or West. If Western medicine saves the lives of millions in the East, why should not Oriental yoga help millions in the West, those engaged in spiritual practice, to attain the equilibrium and psychophysical health that the technical methods of yoga render possible in such an effective way? Exchange of the fruits of experience between the various cultural realms of mankind is simply an expression of the fact of human brotherhood. It expresses reciprocal help between members of a single family, and has nothing in common with spiritual adultery, i.e. with unfaithfulness to the spiritual alliance or faith to which one belongs or to which one is called to belong. All the fruits of human experience merit being studied and examined, and, according to their merit, accepted or rejected. But experience is one thing, and faith or metaphysical ideal is another. With the latter, what is at stake are the moral values that one cannot change without either essential ruin or gain in the life of soul and spirit. One cannot change faith without gaining or losing. A fetishist who embraces Islam gains. A Christian who is converted to Islam loses. The former gains new moral values for his soul, the latter loses moral values from his soul. Regrettable or not, it is a fact that religions constitute a scale of moral and spiritual values. They are not equal, being stages of mankind's evolution over millennia on the one hand, and successive revelations from above on the other hand. There is therefore no religion without value, or that is even intrinsically false or diabolical. But, on the other hand, there is no religion of higher value than that of love. Spiritual adultery is therefore the exchange of a higher moral and spiritual value for a lower moral and spiritual value. It is, for example, the exchange of the living God for an impersonal divinity, Christ crucified and resurrected for a sage deep in meditation, the Holy Virgin Mother for nature in evolution, the community of saints, apostles, martyrs, monks, confessors, church doctors and virgins for a community of geniuses, of philosophy, art, science, etc. We have said that all the fruits of human experience merit being studied and examined, and, according to their merit, accepted or rejected. In speaking of spiritual experience, there are certainly fruits of experience that must be rejected. These are those that are due to theft, i.e., where there is the desire to obtain without effort or sacrifice results whose worth implies effort and sacrifice. Thus Gurdjieff, the master of P.2. Ouspensky, the author of Tetrium Organum, taught that there are three ways of coming out of the confinement of ordinary experience and consciousness: the way of the yogi, the way of the monk, and that of the artful man, put kitrogo kutlevieka in Russian. What the yogi and the monk achieve after long endeavours of discipline and sacrifice, the artful man can achieve without effort, without sacrifice, and almost immediately, taking a pill containing quite assorted elements. There are indeed people who seek transcendental experience by means of the cactus peyote, whose usage towards the end of evoking visions was widespread amongst tribes of Red Indians from Mexico to Canada, which led to the foundation of a Native American church, an indigenous American church, See Oliver Lafarge, A Pictorial History of the American Indian, 1962. What is understandable and quite excusable with respect to American Indians, seeing their desperate situation, is not so with respect to people of European origin, the heirs of the Christian civilization of the West. Those seeking transcendental experience by such means evidently want to dispense with the costs of the way of regular spiritual development, in order to obtain cheaply what others obtain only after much effort and sacrifice. The commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," is still of fundamental importance for the spiritual life. Every school of authentic spirituality owes its continuation to the commandment which preserves its authenticity and which, for the spiritual domain, comes down to a fundamental rule of agricultural labor. You will harvest only after having tilled the earth, only after having sown, and only after having waited for the time when the fruit will be ripe for harvesting. All tricks of a technical nature having as their aim the dispensing with the effort and sacrifice required for normal spiritual growth and development, thus fall under the heading of sinning against the eighth commandment. There still remain two commandments as indispensable for the spiritual life as the 8 commandments already discussed. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour, and thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house. These 2 commandments relate to the spirit of rivalry, which manifests itself either as negative criticism or as envy. This means to say that every spiritual movement, every spiritual tradition, every school of spirituality, and every disciple or so-called master of a school of spiritual life should in no way be motivated by a spirit of rivalry, but rather by love for the cause and ideal. Thus, Saint Teresa of Avila, enamored by the cause and ideal of a life entirely devoted to God, accomplished a profound reform of the Carmelite order without destroying the unity of the Church, and without accusing or condemning anyone. At the same time, the Augustinian monk Martin Luther, given up to the spirit of criticism, thought out a reform of the whole Church, and, carried away by the desire to do better, founded a rival church, whilst declaring Rome as the seat of the Antichrist, and its faithful either as poor strays or as wolves in sheep's clothing. Therefore Saint Teresa, Saint John of the Cross, Saint Peter of Alcantara, Saint Julian of Avila, and other contemporaries of the same spiritual stature would, according to Luther, be strays or ravishing wolves in sheep's clothing, i.e. either deceived or deceivers. Here is a clear case of bearing false witness against thy neighbour, due to the spirit of criticism and rivalry. Anyone who takes on himself the mission of judge can act only in the sense of destruction. Anyone who begins to criticize before long passes to censure, and sooner or later ends up by condemning, which leads inevitably to division into hostile camps and to other forms of destruction. Criticism and polemicism are mortal enemies of the spiritual life, for they signify the substitution of destructive electrical energy for constructive vital force. A complete change of the inspiring and motivating source takes place when a person or spiritual movement becomes engaged in the way of rivalry, with the criticism and polemicism that it comprises. Once carried away by electricity, bearing witness against thy neighbour will always be essentially and intrinsically false. Now, there is no authentic spirituality which owes its origin and existence to opposition or rivalry. To be against something is sterile, and is never capable of engendering a viable tradition or giving birth to a school of spiritual life, whilst to be for something is fertile and is an indispensable condition for all constructive activity. This includes every tradition or viable school of spirituality. The spirit underlying bearing false witness against thy neighbour and coveting thy neighbour's house is spiritually sterile and destructive. Particular spiritual schools and traditions should not, in order to live, be rivals, but should live in consciousness of the kinship of their cause and ideals. If there is kinship, or if there is not, they should respect the domain of freedom of the other, the house proper to it, without mixing this with envy or criticism. If there is no cooperation resulting from kinship of ideals and causes, then spiritual traditions and schools should live and let live in peace. Be that as it may, the totality of the Ten Commandments constitutes the law of life, progress, and fertility for spiritual traditions and schools, just as it is that of the life, progress, and fertility of each individual engaged on a path of spiritual practice. For the Ten Commandments, when comprehended and practiced, signify harmony with non-fallen nature, with the Virgin and the principle of virginity, i.e. with the force of the 11th arcanum of the tarot. This thing is the strongest of all powers, the force of all forces, for it overcometh every subtle thing, and doth penetrate every solid substance. Tabula Smaragdina 9.